You can hear me, my mic is on. Fantastic. Well, thank you for being here, everyone, and for everyone joining virtually. We're looking forward to a great session and hopefully taking a lot of questions and having a nice discussion towards the end. But I think that, first off, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start with Dhanya here next to me.
Thank you. I'm Dhanya Rajindran. I'm a journalist from India, from the city of Bengaluru, which is in the southern part of India. I worked as a journalist with a mainstream television channel for many years, for around 8 years. I don't know if you are accustomed, if you've ever watched Indian television channels, but I would recommend it for the entertainment value because everyone's constantly shouting. And after 8 years of that, I was tired and I did not want to go back to television. I had offers. I was a mid-career journalist, not much savings, but still I did not want to go back to television, which is why I thought I should start something new. And I started TheNewsMinute.com. We are a website which focuses only on southern India. When I say southern India, you may think, okay, that's a small part of the country. It's around 250 to 400 million people in 5 states. So we focus on news from these states because in India, the news is largely driven by newsrooms, which are based out of New Delhi, which is our capital, and Mumbai, which is our financial capital. So people in those newsrooms give more importance to, you know, a country of so many millions of people. How do you decide what are the 7 headlines of the day? And you ignore certain regions. So the whole point of starting the News Minute was to focus on the region. And I'd got tired of the male gaze in news. Everything was reported with the male gaze. So the News Minute was started as an organization which will have a feminist perspective in covering news and look at the region. We started in 2014 and are continuing.
Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Giarrusso. I work for the AP. I oversee sports, business, entertainment, religion, and health and science. I've been at the AP since 1992, and I joined the AP from a program that was started, an internship program was started because women and people of color sued the AP because of a lack of opportunity in leadership positions. And when I started back then, they never let you forget that. It was brought up. Sometimes you were introduced as the minority intern. And that started a long side dedication, because in journalism you have to do the daily work. That's the main thing. But I've always been obsessed with increasing diversity at AP, increasing diversity in our membership, our partners, and just helping the storytelling. Because the storytelling, if it's told from the perspective of white men about my age, it's not going to be the perspective that our readers and our viewers need. So I've been involved in our internship program and recruiting and hiring, and I'll tell you, it's not been a straight line of progress. It's been fits and starts. And from 2008 to 2019, it was really dark days. We didn't, you know, the industry was in trouble, and diversity was kind of this other thing that we will take care of when we get financially stable. And really the summer of reckoning that, and George Floyd's murder changed all of that for the AP. And it was an exciting opportunity for me and our team, and we started a staff-led group of 200 staffers around the world, which is very complex, and I know we'll talk about what diversity means in North America versus what diversity means around the world. But 200 staffers around the world, we call them inclusion champions, and we asked what they want to accomplish in the AP. And believe me, they are very loud, and summarizing that and finding the key parts, that's been our job over the last 2 years, and we made tremendous progress, and I'll talk about that later. But that's where we are now. And I've seen more progress in the last 2 years than in the previous 15 or 20. So I'm excited about this opportunity. And it's going to keep evolving, I think.
Kenya?
Hi, thank you for having me. Kenya Young from WNYC Studios. I'm the Senior Vice President of WNYC Studios with New York Public Radio. And that means I run the podcast division there, which includes a portfolio of Radiolab, Death, Sex, and Money on the media, The Daily Show, The Takeaway, and several others in that portfolio. I've only been there 3 months, so most of what I talk about won't be coming from that experience there, but part of why I was brought there, I'm sure. But prior to that, I've been in public media with my journalism career. I was at NPR for 15 years. I started as an intern, a very unconventional intern. It was my 3rd career shift. I was 32 and married with 2 kids, taken this unpaid internship in the summer for this news magazine. But it paid off at that time. Within that 15 years, I was a producer, as editor, eventually executive producer of Morning Edition and the podcast Up First, and then managing editor in the Newsroom was how I left. So as Michael mentioned as well, spent probably of the 15 years at NPR, a good 10 to 12 working on diversity issues, diversity pilots and projects, which we will talk about why I think that's problematic titling and language, quite honestly. And continue to do so. It is my priority in any leadership position I have. And I think that, as we'll talk, one of my biggest priorities and space that I advocate for is that I think we've made some really good inroads in recruitment. I think we have some issues with retention, and that's where the I is a problem in DEI and inclusivity, and also at the leadership level. So we'll be able to talk about a lot of that today.
We have a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to hopefully leave about half an hour at the end to take questions and have a proper chat. And so we're going to talk about basically the business proposition, like why is this still an issue? Why is it important? What some of the persistent roadblocks are, and hopefully some of the solutions, some of the things that are working. But first, I think we have to agree what we're talking about when we think about diversity. There's the usual race, ethnicity, religion, gender, identity, ability, neurodivergence, region, social class, caste, and I think we all kind of touch on all of those on this panel. And so first, I want to start off with you, Kenya. I read that you said, you're so smart, you say all sorts of smart things, that we need to shift coverage from diverse to talking more about underrepresented and underserved people. And so my question is this really about power? And we're going to talk about all the roadblocks and everything else later, but when I say diversity to you, who or what do you see?
Yeah, and I think that's the big question. I think particularly George Floyd murder and the racial reckoning over the past year or two that's been happening, I will be honest, I think on probably every company, but certainly in journalism, everyone now has a North Star or a talking point, a mission of growing new and diverse audience, to the point where it's getting a little cliche, right? It's a great goal, but what do you mean by that? And how are you going to do that? And what's your plan to make that happen? And that's where I think organizations start to fall short. It's just okay, oh, well, we have it on the list now, but what's the action plan to make that happen? And so for me, as I look to it and as I challenge my direct reports to think about it and my show teams to think about it, it is really about the voices that we're not hearing from, the underrepresented, the underserved. One of the things that we figured out in public media with all this surveying is there's a lot of audience to be had. There's a lot of the business case, right? There's a lot of audience that we are still not getting. As we know, public media can be very white, elite, educated, for the most part, older, and we're membership-based. If those people are starting to die off, we don't have the money from, we need to grab the audience, quite honestly, that is not contributing, right? So there is definitely a revenue factor in it, but it is also about representation. And what we have found is that communities of color, BIPOC audience, really don't listen as much if they are not represented in the coverage, right? It doesn't speak to them. There has to be answer the question of like, why is this for me? Mm-hmm. And so we have to tap into those. And back to the survey, what we found is that not only are we having trouble with Latino and Black and other BIPOC audiences coming to us, they actually don't even know that we exist. So awareness is actually more key for us than anything else, and that's where the underrepresented come in. That's where we have to go into the communities, go where stories are happening that we don't know are happening because no one's telling them. Right now I have a real emphasis on Indigenous communities and stories that are happening there, because not only are there stories there that we don't know are happening, not being told, but there's a different perspective when you take it from there. We just did this great series on opioids and the drug problem, but from a tribal perspective. It was a whole different story than I've heard over the past 3 or 4 years of us covering it. And so I just think it's really important. The only way that we can start to represent and reflect America is to be able to go to those that are underrepresented, go to the underserved communities that typically don't even get a voice in our storytelling.
Okay, and so Dhanya, you cover the 5 most southern states in India. What does diversity mean when you look at your reporting?
So when I started the News Minute, as I said, I was very focused on gender. I knew that I needed a newsroom with more women because I knew that male bosses, if I have male bosses working alongside me, we will continue to produce the same kind of content which every other news organization was doing. So my first focus was to have more women who are leaders, who are senior editors. But after 4 or 5 years, I realized that I have a lot of women in my organization. That's good. We have broken the ceiling as far as gender is concerned, but we were still upper caste women. So in India, one big problem is caste. It's not just gender, it's the hereditary class which the Hindu religion gives to people. Basically, you are born into a certain caste in the olden days, and then you would do a certain kind of job. Some people are sanitation workers, there are people who look after temples, some people are fighters in the army. So there is a segregation of society. People have been fighting against it for years and years. So I realized that, okay, I have 5 women heading my newsroom, but all of them are upper caste women. So our vision, what we look at, is still from a very upper caste angle, and even the word I use, right, upper caste. Mm-hmm. Today I've been taught by my colleagues to not even use the word, to say oppressor caste and oppressed caste, because language has to change, the way we talk about people. So I then started looking at hiring leaders in my newsroom who are from the scheduled caste community and Muslims. So that, I mean, I had colleagues who are junior reporters who are from the scheduled caste communities who are, they are called scheduled castes.
I was just going to say, do we all know what scheduled caste
yes,
is?
I'm going to refer to them as Dalits from now. So I did have reporters who are from Dalit communities who were Muslims, but they were junior level or mid-level. And I realized that to actually have change, you need to have them in the top editorial position. So it was a conscious call. I mean, I'm a newsroom of just 36 to 40 people. So it's also easy for me to take these decisions and consciously do it. But as you were saying about the retention, about hiring people, right? And you were talking about creating awareness that we are writing this content. Now the problem that we face in India is, I run an English website. There are not too many people in India who read English, who speak English. That's a smaller population. And these communities, the Dalit communities or whoever we write about, they read in other languages. They speak in other languages. And that language media does not look at caste at all. They have discriminatory newsrooms. For example, if you belong to an oppressed caste, mostly you will not get bylines. You will be made to sit alone in a newsroom. It's very discriminatory, some of the newsrooms, the way they function. So imagine the way they cover news. If your newsroom itself is discriminatory, the news you cover is going to be even more discriminatory. So the language is a big barrier for us. I can have an English newsroom which is diverse and inclusive, but the audience to whom that story should reach may not necessarily read that language. So there are too many issues, and I think very different from what you face in the US and other countries.
Well, Michael, I did a little reporting on you, and apparently more than half of the world's population sees AP journalism any day. You have about 250 global locations. So from your perch, you work here in the United States, but you're responsible for a lot of coverage that's seen basically everywhere. What is diversity to you when you think about diversity?
You know, it's the biggest obstacle to any change we try to make as a multinational corporation is there's a very defined approach to diversity, especially the last 2 years in North America. Mm-hmm. And we all get it. There are consultants you can hire that can come in. But when we took this to our staff, the big pushback we got was from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. What you're talking about does not reflect what. So we kind of had to invent it on the fly in our own staff and tell the stories that make the sense to the biggest, broadest audience. So we brought it to the staff and said, what are the biggest issues? I won't bore you. There were a lot of issues. I mean, a lot. And we're evolving and going through them. But the first kind of 3.5, they identified as language. You talked about language too. You know, if we use the wrong language, then we make people feel that they're not being spoken to. And we run the style book. John Danishevsky, our standards editor, is here. It's a very important thing. When we make a change, like stop using the word illegal immigrant, the phrase, that's a big change that affects academia, other journalism. So can we be faster in that change and not worry about the publishing of that book, but think about it as an online document that you have online access. So we immediately changed a lot of things. We capitalized black. We changed our wording around disability. We had a huge chapter update on trans issues. These are evolving fast. The other thing they identified is stop treating communities like monoliths. This is very hard for American journalists, especially during a national election. There's the religious right, there's the black community, there's the Hispanic community, which is like a dozen different communities, right? You have to be specific and you have to be thoughtful. Are you getting the rainbow of that community? And if you aren't, you're not just losing the audience, you're offending them. Yeah. So don't treat communities like monolith. And that has been something that we have pushed all the way down. And our friends and colleagues, it was so funny, our friends and colleagues in Europe and in the Middle East said yes when we said that. And their monoliths were different than ours. It was treating the Pakistani community in England like it's one community, like it's not diverse and has different types of people. So the same things that were happening to Hispanic journalists were feeling about North American coverage, folks in Europe were feeling about the coverage of other communities there. And then the final thing we decided was first of all, we're not going to call it man on the street interviews anymore because that's offensive, but vox pop, getting reaction. And this is the hardest challenge because if you want to tell all the stories, you can't go to suburban white schools and tell the story of education post-pandemic in the United States. You have to go everywhere. And you can't just go to urban schools too. You have to go to North Dakota and Montana and see that. That's hard. That costs money. And in the Middle East, if you're going to get reaction to stories, it's going to be difficult to find women to interview just because of cultural issues. But you have to do that extra step and go after that. So those were the first kind of three things. Now the other thing they identified, which is a little harder to fix with the staff-driven, is leadership. And we didn't parking lot that, but we talked about how could this group influence senior management changing, looking more like the world that we cover, and being at least listening to that, because that takes a lot longer.
So let's talk about the business case, and I think we've all kind of touched on that a little bit. We're talking about leaving audiences behind. How much of a push, Michael, did you get from your customers in terms of diversity? How much of a push is coming from that end?
So it's recent, but it is a massive push. I won't mention the customer, but it's one of our top 10 customers. We listed the normal things we do, the metrics that they use, and they go, we don't want to talk about that. What are you doing about inclusive coverage, and what can I show my board that you are going to participate in that helps our coverage look more like the world that we cover? And our sales staff, there were no editorial people there, were stumped because they'd never been asked that before. So they actually brought us in to talk about what we had been doing. So that is an anecdote, but it's an anecdote that we've seen again and again, that customers want this. And the hard thing is devising a metric that shows that you're doing it, but there are ways to do it. It's not a perfect metric. Maybe it's social media, that you're reaching young audiences, that you're using Snapchat or TikTok to reach that audience that is not going to our traditional sites. But over the last 2 years, customers have mentioned it again and again, and we're still evolving our pitch around this.
So, Kenya, you talked about donors, that if your usual listeners are not with us for much longer or they're changing, how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, and I would actually add to Michael's, and also a little bit of a counter, in fact. I agree with that when it comes to donors, and for us it's sponsorship, right, and what they're looking for. But we also very much are challenged with our audience, right? And I will tell you that, you may think public media audience is the kind of the kumbaya space, but there is pushback, and I think there's pushback from, we have gotten over many times, over some hires, over some on-air voices, well, they don't sound like NPR, right? They don't sound like what I'm used to. And sometimes you just gotta say, thanks, and drag that email to the trash, quite honestly, right? Like, there are some things that you just need to do for the greater good, and understand that there are some listeners, some readers, some viewers that are not ready for the change. And I think we face that on the daily, not the daily, the pod, on the daily as in our life. And so there are still challenges as leaders, as journalists, that we are facing, of people who are still resistant to it as much as it is being called for. And you have to push back that and recognize that we may lose some listeners. We may lose. There's some people, if I'm being honest, on staff who might not be brought aboard, right? Like they're hemming and hawing on how many DEI workshops do we have to go to this time? You can't bring everyone along, and that is not my purpose, is to bring everyone along. My purpose is to diversify and include, and if they happen to fall off along the way, they do. And so there's a space where you have to answer for some, but you also have to push in a way that is not always what's asked for, and sometimes I think we're actually a little late on it.
Yeah. So Dhanya, you started your news service in 2014, right? And so over the years, you already touched on this, very women-focused the first 4 or 5 years, and then realizing you needed to expand your employee base. And how is that playing out? What do you hear from your readers, from your users? Are they responding in a positive way? Do they notice the change? Do they care?
They do. I mean, I think readers are very cognizant of changes that happen in newsrooms. For example, when it comes to women's issues, over the years they know that, okay, we will go to the NewsMinute to see what do they have to say about this. For example, this whole Keanu Reeves trial, I cannot tell you the kind of impact it's had in India. Sorry. I keep confusing the two. Johnny Depp, yes. The Johnny Depp trial.
And
I know, I'm so sorry.
Keanu Reeves is on trial?
And no judging the fact that Michael knew exactly right away what we were talking about. We love our friends who love popular culture.
So the Johnny Depp trial has been keenly watched by Indians, and the last 6 months has seen a resurgence of the male rights activists in India. And it's really problematic. So I feel like all the work that we have done in the last 7 years, or whether it's Me Too, whether it's just normal issues, right? Like are girls getting educated, are women getting better jobs, all those things. There is such a pushback now. This whole Johnny Depp thing, even in India. So it's really amazing. So for us, but the audience realizes, they know that I think it's important for newsrooms to be inclusive, diverse, etc. Because it's not just about the head count. It's not like you have a lot of people from diverse backgrounds. And when I hire someone from a Dalit community, I'm not telling the person blend into my organization. I'm telling that person, bring your thoughts here. Let other people understand what your thoughts are and blend with those thoughts. So when the organization changes that way, people notice. And they realize that you take a certain stand in a story, or this is the way you report a certain story. And over time, you also develop loyalties. Like a lot of people who come to the NewsMinute, for example, are because of our coverage of this sensational case in one of the states where a top movie actor hired goons to rape another movie actor in a car. I mean, he's accused of doing that. So we took a very strong position against the actor associations, which are really powerful in India. Like film actors are really powerful in India, and they also become politicians at some stage, and they become chief ministers. No prime minister, thankfully, yet. So, when you pick an issue and you go behind it and you have a stand, audiences do realize that, and loyalty is built. So whether it's caste, gender, whatever it is, if your news organization over the years has built a sort of reportage, audiences do recognize it.
Okay, so I mean that touches on so much I want to talk about. I'll set this up with a recent survey by the Pew Pew Center, and I realize it's American focused, but I think it is telling. Pew Center recently asked 12,000 US-based journalists a pair of open-ended questions. They asked them to write down one thing that the news industry does well and one thing that the news industry does not do well. So that was the two open-ended questions to 12,000 US-based journalists. Topping the best job done out of these 12,000 people were getting the news out. Apparently, that's what we do well as journalists, so good for us. And we also adapt to industry change, right? So I guess that means we hire millennials, right? What we don't do well at, what we did worst at, is getting the story right and being unbiased, right? And that's interesting. I mean, that really, and again, they were open-ended questions, and those were the two overriding issues. And so, again, realizing this is US-based, I still think that it does resonate globally. And to me, it really comes down to access and power. Who has access to our newsrooms? And then who has the power, who has the authority to speak? Dhanya, I loved what you said about not asking people to blend in, right? Someone I was speaking to recently said, you know, one of the hardest things that they do is not asking the younger journalists in their newsrooms to just be quiet, right? Because, well, what are they going to say now? What are they going to ask for? Well, whatever it is that they're going to say and ask for might actually be helpful. And so, is this about leadership? And how do you put in place in newsrooms the spirit of, we need to open up the leadership. We need to not just have more diverse people around the room, but really appreciating that people do contribute in different ways. Can you speak with that to that?
Yeah, that's actually very much a focus in my hiring and my direction to direct reports in their hiring, because I do think, Dhanya, actually similar to what you were talking about with kind of the cast hiring, the socioeconomics. I mean, it's really the same in the US with newsrooms, because at some point, I think the push took a turn and kind of backfired, in which it would, and I hate this term, but there was like a quota count, right? We're just what's our percentage of African Americans? What's our percentage of Latinos? What's our of Asian Americans? And not a more in-depth look of who we were bringing in. So if I hire a Black woman from Columbia and a Latino journalist student from Harvard and on down the line of all the Ivy Leagues, do you know what I'm going to get at the table? Still the same thought, quite honestly. They are all pitching me from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, and from the AP. No disregard. But that's what we read. That's what we've been trained to read, right? And when I hire and when I look, I have to look at the whole table. And so there was one time I hired an intern, a young white guy from, I think, Utah, but he was so interesting to me because he was homeschooled all his life. That is a diversity of thought that normally never comes into NPR, right? And he's going to pitch from a different space and look at things very differently. And so you have to, I believe, when you're hiring and bringing diverse candidates in, I think it's very important, obviously, to have a very diverse pool and a diverse panel, because there's different perspectives and different things that you look at when you're bringing people in, right? So I do think I think a lot of organizations have policies now, right, of how diverse your panel, or they should, how diverse your panel is that is looking, what the diversity of the pool is. But I also think there is a space we have to think, and this goes to our sources as well, as I think you guys can speak. I had to really change NPR's mind is what does an expert mean? And I'll be quite honest, if I'm getting an African American scholar, Columbia professor on history, that's great, and we've changed the thought process there quite a bit, right? Because that professor probably had a different experience coming in through academia. But I also challenge, there's state schools that have very good professors and thought leaders in this industry. There are economists in Alabama that we can go talk to, right? Not be so coastal. And that changes the texture, particularly for audio, that changes the texture of what you're hearing, but it changes the perspective. When I come to the table as a leader, as a PA 10 years ago, as an editor 7 years ago, as an executive producer greenlighting, you're talking about leadership, what is it that I choose to greenlight? I'm not just coming as a black woman. I'm coming as a black woman. I'm coming as a graduate of the University of Notre Dame with a Catholic background. I'm coming as a mother of 3 black boys in this country. If you don't think that that made a difference in the coverage we did for George Floyd with me being at the table at Morning Edition, right? Like that is, all of that comes forward and your life experience. So it is the diversity plus, right? Is the diversity of your life and your life experience that really changes it. Because otherwise, we're all quarterbacks at the table, and you're not going to win a game that way.
But that's what Barbara, our friend, mentioned at the beginning. The numbers don't really tell the whole story. And so I dare say that we're touching on the big I word, inclusion, right? Which is, that's thorny. I mean, Michael, how do you make, which sounds terrible, it's like telling you, how do you make a kid enjoy their vegetables, right? How do you make inclusion happen? How do you actually foster that?
For a long time we thought it was hire inclusive staffs, but if that staff is always being brought in at the same level and told to fit in, I mean, I grew up in public housing and mobile homes, but when I got to the AP, I tried to look like the Ivy School folks and sound like the Ivy Leagues and the Medills and the Columbia folks. And I think everybody, all of us Gen X people of color that entered the workforce, tried to fit in. And this new generation, they do not. They embrace complexity, and that is terrific. And I think what we've seen is we tried to get inclusive storytellers at every level of the production and story process. So someone will say something when a story or a piece of content doesn't meet the standards, is missing a big piece. And we are very good at the AP of getting the breaking news out, where the question is, what are you good at? What are you bad at? We're bad at embracing the complexity of all the after effects or the causes of whatever that story was. So to embrace that complexity, you need people from all around the world looking at it in all different ways. And the AP also publishes a lot, too much. And really, most of what people see is our top 10, maybe our top 20 stories. If the gatekeepers are deciding that Ukraine, White House, inflation are always 1, 2, and 3, it doesn't matter what we're doing, what the young staffers are doing on the effects of men's rights reacting to Johnny Depp, because nobody's going to see that story. We needed to diversify the gatekeepers. It's an evolving process, but we have a very new and updated team on audience who's working on, the news should look like a menu. It shouldn't look like these are the things that you have to do, a class list that you have to read this. And sometimes that means lighter stories. Sometimes it means a lot more stories about people of color and women than we traditionally have done. So I'm not saying we're there yet, but we recognize the problem, and we're putting people in position where they can help do that gatekeeping.
Dhanya, before we go back to Kenya, how much of a benefit do you think it is that you are such a young, smaller, but mighty news organization? And do you appreciate how much authority that you have to make decisions, while it may take more legacy organizations perhaps longer to make change happen?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I just want to quickly, my head is still stuck on Keanu Reeves. I'm trying to get over it, but yes. No, I just want to quickly give some statistics about how it works in India so everyone understands. There was an Oxfam, I think UN Women survey 2 years ago, which looked at 121 newsroom leaders across Indian newsrooms, digital, print, and TV. There was not even one newsroom leader from a Dalit community. When it comes to women, it's like 26.3 for digital, 20.9 for TV, and 13.6 for 5% for newspapers. Why is it 26.3 for digital? Because people like me who didn't want to go back to mainstream started their own ventures. That's the only reason why the number is better there. But in the mainstream media, it's still horrible. It's bad for women. It's bad for people from various castes. Now, for a small newsroom like us, my first lesson was because the person who's second in command in the office, who's the editor, she's from a queer community. And the way she was able to actually ensure that our coverage follows a certain language, right? And I had a staunch feminist writer as the second editor. So simple things like India has a lot of stalking murders, like men just fall in love and they just pour acid or they just kill women. And newspapers have a tendency of calling these men jilted lovers. So, you're qualifying that murder as, okay, they have an excuse. They were jilted by the woman, right? So we started calling them harassers and stalkers. Indian media uses the word eve teasing a lot. We don't call it eve teasing. What is eve teasing? It is harassment. It is sexual harassment. So the language change which we did, which got incorporated by a lot of bigger media houses. In fact, recently, one of my colleagues, she worked with an NGO in India, and they came up with a directory, a glossary of terms for the LGBT communities in Tamil. Tamil is a language in India which is used by a large population, and they have really transphobic, queerphobic terms which are still used. So we came up with an entire glossary of what are the terms to be used, and one of the bigger courts, the High Court in that state, has accepted it. The government has accepted it now, and they have put out a government order saying that only these words can be used from now. So it's only because we are a small news organization that we could do these things. When you are a bigger news organization in India, I don't know about how it works here, but I think in bigger news organizations in India, diversity is not a question at all. Inclusion is not their problem. They are on the news cycles every day. They have politicians to fight, governments to write about. Diversity in the newsroom is not a topic at all now.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, one of the things that Michael touched on, and we're talking about inclusion, there's also things that internally just must be done and must be considered. And I think the unfortunate thing is oftentimes with organizations, it's seen as extra, but it is extra.
And I just want to throw out this thought, because I think it is related, at least I hope it is. It's about speed. The crush of speed.
Right.
And it's not even the crush of speed to keep up with the competition. It's the crush of speed just to keep up with the news flow,
cycle.
right? And so if I want to make a decision fast, I probably will sit down and talk with myself. Most of the time I agree with myself. I think I'm pretty brilliant, and that's what we're going to do. Or I'll talk with someone else who's like me, right? And that person who's like me may be my same race and gender or identity, but they may not be, but we have certain things in common, right? And so we'll approach things from the same point of view, and we'll all agree and go and get a coffee, right? Diversity sometimes takes a little bit more time. It doesn't take a hell of a lot more time at the end of the day. You get there. You do want to hear about the younger people in the newsroom and what they're thinking and how they see things, or understanding that to use an American example, that the Black American community is made up of Caribbean people and people from Africa and people who are from all over the place. So I think that ties a little bit into what you're saying. How do you make space in the newsroom for diversity?
Right, and I think it goes back to, what you were talking about too, as far as allowing those pitches to happen, the space to happen, that conversation to happen. How do we not quiet them, right? And that's the whole reason to have any of us at the table, quite honestly, right? And I do think there needs to be, that's that inclusion. There's this sense of belonging. We can hire and we can recruit, but if these candidates, if these employees don't feel like they belong, if they don't feel like they're heard, I hear that a lot, that I don't feel heard. The language we use, listen, every pitch is not great, right? Even if it is a pitch coming that has to do with race or with gender. There are times where I've had to not greenlight pitches, but it didn't have to do with it just wasn't a great pitch. But the language, I think, that you bring to the table of, why don't you, and that's giving it the time. It's not quite there yet. Spend a little more time with that and bring it back, rather than just, there used to be a time, we all know as journalists, they just cut you out. No, not, throw it out the window. And there needs to be more space for feedback. There needs to be more space for mentorship, and there needs to be more space for career development. And that's hard in a newsroom when you're just trying to push it out and get it out. So there's two sides. There's the career development part of staff, and then there's also obviously the sourcing. And a lot of times you're just going to go to the source. The Queen's just died. You're going to the best sources you have to get them on the air within the next 2 to 3 minutes, right? But there has to be a leader in place that says, I also need someone to think about the African diaspora and how they're affected by this, because this is a different story and a different point of view. So someone go work on that. And there has to be not only the space, but there has to be someone in mind at top greenlighting that thinks in that way as well to make that happen.
We say nobody's pressed for speed more than the AP. I mean, it's in our DNA. Still, even at AP, we can't let the urgent trump the important. And I'm telling you, we do it every day. I would just wish we did it a couple fewer times a day. And often you have to force it. You have to force the discussion. I mean, it happens in hiring. We had a position where we advertised this person has to speak Spanish. They're going to go into the communities in southern Florida and they have to speak Spanish. And we went through the process, and our Spanish speaker pulled out at the last minute, and we had other candidates, and we decided just to say no and to start over, and we did find one. It took 4 months, and the beginning of a breaking news story that we missed because we didn't have somebody there, but it was more important to wait. And it happens in breaking news, too, where you decide, should we send this crew to this disaster who knows how to cover underserved communities, or should we serve, the same folks that we normally say? And you have to decide to do the important sometimes.
Can we talk about, and then we'll open up for questions, can we talk a little bit about what is actually working? What do you think are there actual, tangible, not counting on personalities, because a lot of this sounds like very personality-based. Are there actual strategies that in your experience are actually working, that are actually effective?
So one thing that I think is really effective, and it's interesting because it's controversial from from organization to organization, but and it even took a while to bring me along to agree to do it. But I can't say enough about source tracking, quite honestly. People see it as just data and numbers, and it is not, because the bottom line, as I used to tell my team and still tell my NYC teams now, if you don't even know who you're going to or not keeping track of what you're putting on, then you don't know where you need to improve, right? And so one of the things I did when I ran Morning Edition, I created a diversity council, and they implemented a source tracking project, which eventually became one of the models for NPR and the source tracking across NPR, across all desks and shows. But it wasn't enough. What I think where people fall short is it's not just enough to track. So in the mornings, the producer in charge would bring the daily results. Like, we would start our pitch meeting with, who are the divorce sources that we had on the show today? And if there were none, it was right there on our face. We saw that. At the 3:30 wrap-up meeting, who are the diverse sources we have on the show tomorrow? And in the beginning, it's a process. And what I found over time, 6 to 8 months later, it just became the way my staff worked. So sometimes it's seen as mundane, sometimes it's seen as just tracking or quotas or numbers, but it is also changing the way people think. And then the next thing you know, a producer is organically thinking about how they are sourcing a story or how many diverse voices they may have in a story. And it starts to change your coverage, it starts to change your program, and it starts to change just the team environment of how you approach your coverage.
I'll try to go fast. There are some things that are working. You mentioned the study of diversity in newsrooms. I'll call it transparency and shame. You should be transparent about what your hiring is, what your staff is, and you should be ashamed of it if you're at the bottom of that list, and you should react to that shame, because nothing else has moved people. Even my colleagues at the IOC, at the Olympic Committee, by the way, who have their own transparency and diversity problems, put up the diversity gender diversity of the reporters that cover the Olympics. And it was, to see your name near the bottom of that, and it's terrible. I mean, thank God for Reuters, because we were not quite as bad as them, but it changed the way we cover the Olympics. We put a much more diverse team. And how important was that in a summer with Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, and a winter with Nathan Chen and 16-year-old girls that were forced to dope? I mean, it was so important to have new staff there, and we did that in part out of shame and transparency. And I'll say another thing that's working is kind of staff-driven leadership. We started a Slack channel with instant communication where anybody in our staff can complain about any piece of content, and believe me, they are loud and fast, and we call it our urgent action Slack channel. So if you see something, we're not going to fix it tomorrow and apologize. We're going to fix it in cycle, and everybody who's involved in that is going to know this was a problem. You should have never done that. Because we had too many problems that we apologized for the next day. We can't do that. We have to fix it in cycle. So urgent news and letting everybody know this is how you fix it. So those things have worked for us.
What is effective? I think the language in the media has changed quite a bit. We've been able to force, any organization in India which is inclusive, diverse, it has been able to influence the mediascape and change the language in which people report. But as far as hiring is concerned, or even the surveys that I said, most news organizations don't reply to the survey. So one of the surveys they sent me, they had like 10, 15 questions. What is your name? What is your age? Blah, blah, blah. Last question is, what is your caste? I'm like, this is the actual question. But they camouflage that as a last question, because if they put it first, half the editors will not reply. So that's how bad the situation is. I think there's not enough shaming done in India. We have to really, the shaming is mainly in how the coverage happens. So the coverage has become better, but there's not been much progress in hiring, in ensuring that people are in top managements.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? And we can get a mic to you. Or okay.
I just wanted to make a comment, if I may. Hi, I'm Renan from IPI. I'm running our Turkey program, and I just want to say such great conversation we had here. I'm really impressed, and I just wanted to make a small comment about the, how important topic, like this topic is so important, and it works in a way, at least from Turkey. I want to give an example. Yeah, in Turkey, Turkish media is completely or almost majority or 90% is composed of white Turkish, privileged Turkish male. And I think Kurdish media is something completely under big suppression, and we are still fighting for it, for their rights and to have their equal voice in it. But also, for example, in the media coverage, we have been, I can see the transition in Turkey, at least Turkish media, how we are covering, how the media is covering the LGBTQ rights and community, for example. This wasn't even an issue until maybe a decade ago. It wasn't even a like publicly talked topic in Turkey. I can say these kind of leadership conversations, topics really changed how media had covered the queer community, how the right language was forced to be used, and also same for Kurdish media too, or other communities. So I think in that sense, I always have the feeling like people say, like, oh my God, just wait, like we cannot be politically correct all the time. But I disagree. I just wanted to say the language you use makes the difference, and eventually the media, what media uses, force those political figures and politicians to confront the problem. Even though they don't care, even though they dismiss these issues and problems, they are eventually forced to confront it, and that's where change comes from. Thank you. Sorry.
I just want to add one quick thing. I mean, we have spoken about gender, race, caste, etc. But one thing we did not touch upon is religion. For example, one huge problem that we are facing in India is Islamophobia in the media. Most media organizations are led by upper caste Hindu males. And the kind of coverage, like they call, Muslim boys who may have been listening to the Pakistani anthem as parasites on television. this is the kind of language that they use, that they should be hung to death and they should be beaten up. News anchors are saying these things. So, and I sometimes wonder what is the atmosphere inside the newsroom, where there must be one Muslim reporter in a newsroom of 50 to 60 people. They would crack jokes. They would be speaking insensitive things. Like when there's a bomb blast, they'd immediately say, "Your guys must have done it." So that kind of language in the newsroom, and now it's on air. It's on all television channels. So that's because we don't have Muslims in Indian newsrooms in top positions again. So that's one diversity I think that we have completely ignored.
And I would just add to that too, as we're talking about, again, that goes to the language of the underrepresented communities, right? I think we've programmed ourselves for all of the equity training over the years, right? Diversity is often race and class and ethnicity, and we are in a time now where diversity, adding on the queer community, adding on disability language, the way we're changing our language around disabilities, the way we're changing our language around mental health. We're challenged with this quite a bit in our news organization to make sure that we are particularly trans right now with all of the oppositions happening in the South. And so, again, I think diverse can mean so many things to so many people, and when you start thinking about the underrepresented, you get to then hone in on truly, one of the things I used to always say, Mike, it made me think of it, at the pitch table, you could do a story over and over again, and you got to do it every day. Daily news, you got to use the same story. Remember when Trump was doing the tax cuts? I was so sick of our table. Every single show led with tax cuts. And I finally had to say, but what have we not heard yet, right? My top question is, what voice are we not hearing in this story? And that makes you rethink how you book, how you write, and how you cover a story when you're constantly questioning, who have I not heard from in this news story that I've talked about 3, 4, 5 days in a row?
The funny thing about that is that it's often a better story because it's not the same story. It's less boring.
Yeah. Question?
Oh, yeah, hi. I'm Gabrielle. I host a podcast for the Council on Foreign Relations, looking at you. So obviously the world of IR suffers from the same as, media. We call it pale male in Yale. So we have a million questions as people on our ERGs. So I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on employee resource groups, what role they should be playing in the organization, what level of access they should have. And I also, to slip another one in, wanted to know how you sort of push back against, or what you think of the solution of pipeline. I get told a lot that it's the pipeline, we're solving it from the bottom up. You have to bring in these new candidates and then they can rise up. We can't just replace people at the top so it's this pipeline thing, and they tout a lot of diverse intern pools and stuff like that. So those are sort of just two things I'm curious about.
I can go first and then pass you. That pipeline is bullshit, and so for decades the AP would show, because they were good numbers, that interns and temps were being brought in at a high level of diversity. We weren't retaining them for various reasons, not always because of us, because they had lots of opportunity. And it's just not true. You have to do it at all levels of leadership, and that takes buy-in all the way to the top. ERGs are interesting. That's what my group is. It's an employee resource group. It lives in the newsroom. We have another larger group, a wider group that includes our business side, sales, everybody, and we meet once a month. So to share things that are happening, I think again, fits and starts. Like, what are we doing well? Because we should be diverse in our sales team, I just told you about that. They wanted to talk about diversity, and sales wanted to talk about metrics. So we have to be diverse all along, but it needs commitment from the very, very top. And we have a CEO for the first time that's a woman of color, so it's starting to get better.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that ERGs, I think I opened with this in that, I was a part of a lot of diversity pilots and diversity projects over the years. And the reason I say that language is problematic is because a pilot and a project has an end date. It has a start date and an end date. And when you end, suddenly the diversity ends, right? Like, it's just like, oh, we're going to work on this for this summer. Was a producer and did this summer unemployment. It's when during the recession, youth unemployment programs or coverage. And I got some great results on it. It was about timing, right? I had to source 5 different sources of different backgrounds for each story that we're putting. That takes a lot of time, rather than just picking the Rolodex and going to the same person that you always go to, right? And it yielded results, right? But then it was over. And I did a report, and I sent it to our chief diversity officer, and it was great, and yeah, and then it's that. I think that ERGs are a bit of an answer to that, right? There's still a space in which I think there's work to be done depending on how committed the ERG is, but that makes it ongoing. It is a group that is committed to a diversity pilot or project ongoing, and there is no end as long as the company still supports it. At NPR, one of the things that was created within the last year or two was just a space for women of color. Because we heard from the most in our surveys the dissatisfaction from women of color. So that's where we focus the most and the ERG focus most. And we were talking about inclusion. ERGs are also a way to answer or help solve the inclusion problem. These became, particularly in the pandemic, very safe spaces for women of color to say whatever the hell they wanted to say. Sorry, my aunt is here, I can't cuss too much. But to say whatever they want and know that it stayed right with it. Like what happens in this ERG stays in this ERG. And that's how you start to create that sense of belonging and that sense of inclusion for those who are brought in and feel very out of place at the table, quite honestly.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Very interesting panel to listen to. My name's Torbjørn Isaksen, I'm from Norway. You touched on this, or at least I heard you somewhat touch on this, and it was more of a political diversity, and not opinion-wise, of course, that's for the editorial pages, but when it comes to perspective, perhaps seeing the problems that you, from a political lens, conceive in your daily life reflected in the media. And I know that this is a special big discussion with deep roots in the US, for example, so I would love to hear your perspectives on that, also from an Southern Indian perspective.
Political diversity as to people who believe in the right and the left and everyone in a newsroom. I don't know, I have scary thoughts about that kind of diversity because I'm pretty sure in Indian newsrooms it is quite limited now because we are very polarized. As a news media, we're very polarized now. We're either on the left or on the right. It's evident from what we write, what we cover. And to have someone come in who's from a different viewpoint, there's a lot of fear within newsrooms, right? Like you discuss a lot of things on your Slack or your WhatsApp. You don't know that person is going to quit at some point of time and put screenshots out of what you're saying. So there is a lot of fear. I don't think political diversity as far as inclusion hirings are in my plan as of now at all.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and I'm sure AP has grappled with it. We certainly, as you can imagine from NPR headlines, have grappled with it. But I think it's very interesting that it was one of the things that was the lowest in the Pew research that you cited, which was not being unbiased. And it is in public media particularly, like where we have to think about stations. We're across the country. So while we are heavily coastal on the East Coast and the West Coast, we are in very rural areas in Lexington, Kentucky and Lubbock, Texas. And there's a diversity of thought within our audience, right? And so I come from a space which tends to surprise people, quite honestly, and my team. Again, what is the voice that we're not hearing? And sometimes that's the voice that you don't want to hear. And I have gotten pushback, quite honestly, from the younger of what, we don't want to book that. I feel one of the most recents that I can think of when I was still at NPR, I felt like the organization fell very short. I think it was the Texas abortion ruling, because I think that was the first ruling that kind of started the wave, if I remember correctly. And if you heard our air, and heard from show to show and from reporter to reporter and even midday, you would have thought that the entire country, 99.9%, was outraged at this decision. And I just don't, while it is the thought of a lot of people and the thought of a lot of people in our organization, quite honestly, that is not the truth. That's not accurate. And my challenge to those who were booking were, if this went the other direction, you would be trying to book the defendant. You would be trying to book the, and so, but there was no one for 3 or 4 days who wanted to even go that direction because they don't want to hear it. And that's not our job to put out there, at least in my space as a journalist. So even as a black woman, there are voices that I challenge my staff we need to hear, whether it could be when transgender with the military was coming out, no one wanted to hear. There are many people who don't agree with this decision. We have booked every single person who is affected by this, and that is good to present. But there is a reason why this is an issue, and it's because there are other. So I don't believe in the both sidesisms. I think it's a fine line between the both sidesism and there's good people on both sides kind of thing, right? But I do think that we are doing a disservice to our audience if we create this space in which only one thought is put out there, and then you suddenly start to think, oh, well, this is the way the world is going, and because that's all I heard. There are other political thoughts to be heard and that need to be heard, quite honestly. And it's not the crossfire. It's not the Republican versus the Democrat. It's not, no one wants to hear that. That sounds awful. But it is understanding, particularly when it's not a minute space, like abortion or there's so many I can think of, but that you have to hear that there are still people who feel this way and think this way, and that's why this has been politicized or become an issue in our country.
I mean, a major problem for AP to balance, but it's our core, right? We are at the center of most of those media bias charts for a reason, and we take that seriously, and we have to. It's a business imperative. It's our mission. Our Fox News is one of our biggest customers, so we have to be down that way. I will say, I think it's just obvious that a journalism organization based in New York with a massive office in London and the industry we're in is going to self-select for a certain population in this polarized environment. How can we fight against that natural inclination? How can we force ourselves? And often, we take, I see people who I know might in their heart be a different way politically, talk about the undertold stories. And we talked a lot about that on the day of the abortion ruling. We talked a lot about that. There are hundreds of millions of Americans celebrating. This was their North Star. Hundreds of millions of Americans that are happy about this. And if our headlines all look like this, even the packaging has to look, it's not just, you can't just have one story about the religious right celebrating. You have to have a package of content that looks like it represents everybody that's affected, and that's hard, and it's probably one of the things we struggle with most on a day-to-day basis.
And I think the most pushback that we get is for lack of political diversity. People say, but you guys are all the left-wing media, you guys are all the right-wing media, you don't have diversity of opinions. I mean, both isms is very dangerous, but these are deeper questions. For example, when women are being stopped from wearing hijab to colleges in India, it happened in the state that I come from. Should I have a reporter who would say that hijab should not be worn, and then they work towards that kind of a story, vis-a-vis talking about human rights? So these are deeper questions for newsrooms to figure out, I think, as to what is the kind of political diversity that you want. Even if it is there, can you assure that that reporter or that journalist is biased to truth, that truth is only bias as far as they're concerned, and how do you maintain that?
Yeah, my question is about inclusion of people with, let's say, health challenges, especially mental health. And while it's, again, good from a diversity perspective to have people with different life experiences come in, there's also conflict with the organizational needs, right? You have to get the story out, and productivity, and a lot of other things are also at stake. How do you balance this? I know Dhanya and I have kind of discussed this many times, but in general, I'd like to know how organizations deal with this, because especially, I don't know whether it's kind of related to pandemic, this is becoming a big issue in many newsrooms, is a sense I get, yeah.
Actually, that was going to be one of my questions, how the pandemic has has affected us. I have a podcast, and I recently did a interview with someone who works with a organization that focuses on neurodivergence. And the stats are quite shocking, at least in the United States. 1 out of every 5 people has some sort of neurodivergent issue that goes from ADD to dyslexia. I'm a little dyslexic, why I always print everything really big and I often color code. 1 out of every 10 people will be handicapped in some way. It could just be from a knee replacement in their life. And so that's a great question, but it isn't. I just want to set the stage that this is always amongst us. People who have different needs and need different accommodations. And certainly COVID has highlighted that for so many people. The people who really thrive when they're not in the middle of a crowded newsroom, people who really appreciate that they can put on closed captioning on a Zoom call and can read along. It's such a little thing, but it's really impactful for some people. I'll leave it to the folks who actually run news teams right now, but it isn't, I would just caution that much like diversity or anything else, it isn't necessarily going to detract from the smooth running perhaps of a news. I understand why that could be a fear, but at the end of the day, having a variety of experience and a variety of people in a newsroom may actually result in more thorough coverage. But go ahead.
So in India, journalists tend to work 7 days a week. I don't know how it works elsewhere. They don't have shifts, most people. They just work all the time. Some organizations give 1 day off. So during the pandemic, the young people in my office insisted that we have to make it a 5-day work week. And so we did do that, and we started giving therapy sessions. But for Meera's question as to what do you do, like when I hire a young person, many of them are very open about their mental health issues. They tweet about it, they write about it, they blog about it. So knowing that, okay, now someone who I'm going to hire is bipolar. Should I hire that person? I don't think that has been a deterrent at all. But we need to think about how, after hiring them, how can we help? How can we ensure that as an organization, productivity is important, definitely, but it should not be at the cost of hampering someone's health, right? So how do you make that go hand in hand? But as I keep saying, it's all possible for smaller news organizations to do. I don't know what happens in a large news organization with 500, 600 people. How do you look at mental health issues? Like, for example, a reporter feels down a particular week, they don't want to work. My only red line is reporters who have hallucinations. I don't want them to do ground reporting because I have faced issues there. Other than that, I think mental health is not a deterrent while hiring, promoting, anything.
You know, this is a new challenge. It's that people haven't really talked about in newsrooms before, and I think post-pandemic and return to office has been a big just spark to this discussion. And I think we're all figuring out, we run a union shop, so you know, we have to be careful about consistency, but I think what I've seen in a general sense is leaning into accommodations on an individual basis and not worrying so much about if we do this once, we have to do it for everyone. And some of these accommodations can be very simple, you know, where someone sits in the newsroom, right. You know, how loud it is in that area. And it's been intriguing to me because it's new. Like, folks wouldn't talk about this before, and with the return to office, it's come up a lot more. And mental health has come up on assignments more. Usually, like I said, we tried to fit in. We took whatever we were given. But, you know, if you're going to go to Ukraine and certain things stress you out, you want to talk about how you could thrive in Ukraine coverage with whatever challenges you have.
Yeah, I would add, I think it's difficult because there are privacy issues, there are ADHD issues, if we're talking about disabilities, and again, running an overnight show, I had to deal with that. Overnight doesn't work for everybody. It created some issues for some people, and so I had to take them off the overnight and figure out a different shift, or we had to figure out someplace else for them. So that happens. But I do think some of this goes back into the inclusion space. One, you're right, people are more open. You can't, quite honestly, legally, even if you know someone is bipolar, that is not something that you can bring up, right? You can't say you get to get this story. But when people being more open about it, that is then the diversity of perspective that someone brings to the table. My son's dyslexic as well, so I bring to the table special education parenting and IEPs, and I understand what that means. But I also think there is a space, I can remember, this might not quite be mental health, but maybe, large organizations, we do have EAPs, employee something assistance program, right? So you get 6 free therapies and then, all this kind of stuff. We've called in counselors at different times. But I remember I called NPR on this one time because, a huge traumatic, the Paris bombing, right? The shooting in Vegas, these things would happen. And the HR would send out, either HR or the ERGs, depending on what's going on, well, no, not the ERGs, they'll come in later, but HR would send out the email. Don't forget we have the EAP. Don't forget we have counseling service, all this kind of stuff, right? It's traumatic to cover, what have you. I also was leading shows and programs during the time where it felt like the shootings of Black unarmed men was happening almost every weekend or every month, right? I remember being on the desk when Michael Brown happened and trying to decide whether I was going to put this in the show or not, because there was some part of me that was like, another Black man shot, right? And who knew that would turn into what, and I did put it in the show, thank goodness, but who knew it would turn into what it turned into. But they were happening at this pace that was untenable, and I had just had my 3rd son, and I was nursing him in the middle of the night. I was still on maternity leave. Well, no, I guess I was not, because I went into the office. But, the red dot on your phone. I know when things are happening because suddenly I have 132 notifications at 2 in the morning. Something just happened. And it was during the time of Castile, and there were 3 or 4 back-to-back. Yes. And I was bawling as I am nursing my 6-month-old infant, 3rd Black child that I brought into this country, where there is this country that is shooting people like my children over and over and over again. And I went into the organization that day and said, where's my email? Where's this is traumatic. And at that point, I was running a show. The national desk editor was a Black woman. The AP for All Things Considered was a Black. All these Black women running this story. This is traumatic for us to cover over and over and over again. And so something was sent out, right? Because it did start to shift from being these moments of destruction to then being, and of course then, more recently as the country got more sensitive, of course George Floyd and the shooting of Asian Americans was it Georgia, Atlanta? Yeah, Atlanta. And so that shift starts to happen, but it also happens when people speak up. I have no problem speaking up about things. But I had to challenge my organization to say, I'm traumatized right now as I come in every single day, every single weekend to cover these stories, and I need just as much support from this company as when a bomb goes off in Paris.
We have time, I think, for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Kenya. And I was just going to say that actually one thing that really helped at our organization was when those traumatic shootings were happening one upon another of Black men, we actually had an organization-wide, sharing, I don't know what else to call it, and led by Black women in our BERG, in our Business Employee Resource Group. And it was incredibly upsetting, cathartic, but I think incredibly meaningful for the entire staff. And I was crying the whole time on the Zoom because hearing, I'm a mother, I have a 17-year-old Black son, what do I tell him when he goes out every day? And being able to hear your colleagues talk about that and really share in a real way was so helpful. And it was something that we, of all the Bergs, so the Asian Berg, which I'm in, the Black Berg, all the Bergs shared it, but we insisted that it be given to the whole staff. Yeah. So I don't know I think everybody came. You know, there were screens and screens and screens of Zooms. I think everybody came, but that's something I would really recommend because it's incredibly meaningful to get to see and hear your colleagues share their own experiences. Plus, you become much closer to them. It's something that we forget about in our newsrooms. You know, we're so focused on the news all the time, we're not sharing our own experience as parents, as spouses, as whatever. So I would just really recommend that whenever traumatic things are happening, to allow people to share newsroom-wide, staff-wide. Also, by the way, we invited our social media and marketing teams, people who weren't under the news report. It just made a huge difference. Something I've really shared is my older son has had cancer twice. So I've nearly lost my older child twice. And being open about that, when we talk about stories that relate to cancer, that relate to child care, that relate to health care, I really appreciate that people have come to me and said that makes a difference. Now, I'll also openly talking about being a mom and being a journalist and having to balance all those things. So I just think the more we share about ourselves, the more willing we are to be open about ourselves, I think really helps everybody feel that they belong, that they're included. So, sorry, I don't know. I would love that to be a jumping off point for anyone who wants to share, but I'll just say that was a real success for us.
Well, and I would add that, and I think I brought this up, or Michael brought this up, I mean, that's a part of the experience too. So right at the same time that I was pushing internally my company to acknowledge what many of the Black employees were going through during this, I also was challenged by my chief diversity officer, who I've worked with so much, but so what are you going to do with that, right? And I had to think about, as a journalist, and it was like a Thursday or a Friday. I tore up the Saturday show. I was executive producer of Weekend All Things Considered at that time, and I said, yeah, this rage that I have inside right now, these feelings, how do I, without being biased, without putting on just my reflection, like how am I going to express then in my journalism into my audience what this feels like as a Black mom seeing this all the time, right? And so we busted up the show, didn't throw everything out. I think sure we aired it 2 weeks later. But that entire show then that weekend was about policing, right? And we changed it to a special. We made it a full hour about policing. It was the first time we had done that at NPR. And that's, again, where the leadership comes in. I was in a position to be able to say, tear up the show, and this is what we're going to do. And that's why it makes such a difference to have representation at the editorial level. All of us, I'm sure, could tell so many stories. I remember I was just an editor at that point, but I was editing a story that a young white guy brought in from Chicago, and it was again during their session. It was about unemployment and how people were finding unconventional ways to make money, and he had like different stories, and one of them was a Black woman who turned her living room into a beauty parlor, and I was like, huh? And then I questioned a little, and it's like, oh no, but she's got the seat, and she's got the, and I was like, honey, that's just a little Black girl getting her hair done, right? Like, as a Black woman, I know that, I understand that. It wasn't turned into a beauty parlor. She wasn't running a business out of her. She was just doing hair in her living room, which is the Black experience of getting hair done, right? But I know that because I am a Black woman who has experienced that and all that comes with having Black hair. But what happens, and I think Michael alluded to this, that could have easily gone by anyone else who doesn't understand that. And then it's aired, and then you know what? Then a Black woman like me listens to it and say, they have no idea what they're talking about. They are out of touch with the Black community because they misrepresented what was going on there. There's tons of things I can think of. So there's a headline, we were talking about headlines, there was a headline about, the Black Santa at the Mall of America. Remember, it was the first time. I was like, but we're making it sound like it's the first time that there's a Black Santa. My mom's been taking me to Black Santa since I was 5 or 6 years old. And so having that perspective changes headlines, it changes coverage, it changes the accuracy, quite honestly, for that community when they hear it or read it, and that makes a huge difference.
I just want to add one thing about, just a caution, that when you have people from various communities, as part of your diversity hire or anything, when the head count is there in the leadership, a lot of people don't want to be identified, or they don't want to share the trauma, they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to cover those stories. And I think that also has to be respected with the newsroom, that you can't continuously box them into, okay, you're from this community, you keep covering it, you keep enlightening us, because that is not their job.
Yeah, we have to embrace the diversity of reactions to stories. And I think, the communications tools that we have now, like something like Slack, where you can point a message to a leader. The Asian shootings at the massage parlors in Atlanta was a really telling example of this for me, because there was some bad stuff that the sources were saying, and the instant reaction of the media, including AP, was to repeat that and put it in the headline. This is not a race crime, it's based on fetishization, all these things. Police are not experts on that, and wait a minute, fetishizing, all Asian women is a hate crime. But in the early going, no Asian Americans involved, that stuff was showing up on the wire. And this kind of instant ability for various people, even people in Asia, to send messages to people who were in place to make those changes saved us and forced us to have a conversation the next day and for weeks after about the acceptance of people in authority saying something, the immediate acceptance of that. We cannot do that anymore. Usually, you just ask the cop what happened. We can't do that anymore, especially when it's much more complex than the people in power want it to make it seem.
All righty. Any other questions? One more, and then I was going to try to get us out early for lunch, but I will not.
Quick.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Claire Klobasista. I'm also at the Council on Foreign Relations. Co-chair on an ERG, but coming from the copy editing perspective, curious to hear if any of you guys have guidelines, policies on sensitivity reading. This kind of goes to the crush of the newsroom pace and, trying to hit deadlines, and very tiny team. There's only 2 of us copy editors on the editorial team. And so, we've been thinking a lot about trying to get some of this stuff in place for when your antennae go up and this is something that needs an extra read, and can we go to someone who understands this community better, like you were talking about, Kenya. So I'd love to get your take on the importance of some of these tools like sensitivity reading.
So we've hesitated to put rules around certain topics that are incredibly sensitive because we run so much content. So we've asked folks to do it in an informal way. And we know the stories that trigger these issues, the topics. Trans issues are particularly complex. So anytime someone who doesn't normally cover trans issues is covering it, we run it through a second set, hopefully we have time, of eyes, and we pre-talk about the questions we're going to ask, the way we're going to talk it. So, and there are several topics like that we know are sensitive. So, but we don't want to put this coverage over in a corner and say it gets treated differently, because that in itself is discriminatory. So we have to find this line of experts on our team in-house who are willing to step in and have a second look at that type of stuff. And it's particularly important for headlines and social media, because that, you can't fix that. That's out there.
And it's a constant process. People leave newsrooms. You have to then understand that there's a new wave of people who have joined, and they have to be told the same thing. They come from different organizations or perhaps their first jobs. So it's a continuous process. And the main problem that we face is the pushback from the audience. For example, sexual violence is related to caste in India a lot. So if we write a Dalit woman has been raped, out of 500 comments, 499 are, why are you writing about the caste? It is just a rape. It's a woman who's been raped. Why are you mentioning a caste? And the younger reporters feel very perplexed. They feel threatened when people keep writing this to them, and they tend to self-censor the next time. So you've got to tell them, no, caste has to do with sexual violence. I mean, how much ever the pushback is from your reader, you have to continuously write it.
Yeah, and I would say, audio has its own problem, right? Because there's constantly the question of, are we going to air this or are we not going to air this? How far are we going to go? A little bit video too, right? the parade with the car went through. I was managing editor on that night to figure out how far we were going to go before you started hearing the screams and what happened. So all of that really matters. But I think, as Michael was saying, there's a constant for organizations, the managing editors have to approve some things if we feel like they're sensitive in that. So I will say that, I was challenged during the time of George Floyd because it happened overnight. The story kind of blew up overnight. It was a little bit mentioned on All Things Considered, but by the morning it was huge news. And I did air the audio of the I Can't Breathe. And I was heavily challenged on that. And I think there's a space where you have to, how many times there's so many factors. How many times are you going to air it? For me, when I spoke about why I aired it, it was really the first time that people were hearing it, right? I also think that to understand the gravity of what happened to him, right? There's some level of desensitization that we can't take away. And I'm often thinking, I understand that things trigger people, but I'm often thinking about the other audience who are thinking, oh, it's not that bad. Or until you hear it, until you understand and hear someone saying, I can't breathe, this wasn't I can't breathe, it was get your knee off my neck, right? See, there's so many, I'm mixing them up together. But you can't even understand the gravity of that news and what happened without hearing, or else it's just, quite honestly, not as bad, right? And so there are times where you have to put out there what is really happening, and then you can make some decisions later on content-wise about how often we've done it or what language we're going to use to do it.
Yeah. Right. I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel. I think some of us will be around afterwards. And thank you to IPI and their wonderful team.